I'm Kevin Kaczmarczyk, and you're listening to the Tools of the Trade podcast.
Welcome
Please welcome
to another episode of the Tools of the Trade podcast, your number one construction industry resource. Hear conversations with industry professionals to get the tools, stories, and advice that you need to set your career on fire. You're now streaming the Tools of the Trade podcast.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Netsurance Canada. Get instant online quotes for insurance and bonds, even from a cell phone. Guys, it really is that simple. Just head over to netsurance.ca. That's NETSURANCE.ca for all of your insurance and bonding needs. What's up, guys? Thank you so much for tuning into another episode of Tools of the Trade. I'm your host, Colin Toop, and I have made it my mission to bring construction professionals from all different aspects of the profession onto this podcast to ask them not only the questions that I would want the answers to, but hopefully to try and extract some of the key resources and tools that you can deploy from these professionals directly into your business or your career as a construction professional. Right now, we are currently midway through Project Management Month, and this month, I am bringing together 4 amazing minds in project management to talk about the state of project management, the construction industry, and all sorts of amazing tools and tips that you can deploy in your project management career. Or if you're interested in becoming a PM and you want to know what it's all about, these are the episodes for you. This week's guest is a guy by the name of Kevin Kaczmarczyk. And Kevin is very interesting and has some great experience because he now works for Ontario Power Generation, O.P.G for short, and what most of us would call the client side of the business. Now, as contractors, we're typically working for the client, but Kevin has had a unique opportunity to work now on the client side with the construction background. So he's able to blend the two of those disciplines together and speak the language to the contractors that I think so many of us are trying to do, whether we're on the client side speaking to contractors or vice versa. At the end of the day, we're all trying to say the same thing. We're trying to get projects done, but sometimes it's a little hard to convey the message because we're not speaking the same language. And Kevin talks about how we can do a better job at bridging that gap. He is very, very passionate about project management, building, constructing, and he has had quite a decorated career. He is a guy that has actually said he has never been a part of a failed project. So there's a lot to learn from him. He's got some great insights into project management. It's a very exciting episode. We recorded this live at O.P.G's head office in downtown Toronto, which was amazing. It just finished a major renovation, which is absolutely beautiful. If you are enjoying this podcast and you want to find out more about other guests or get some blog posts and resources, please head over to toolspodcast.com. And without further ado, please welcome Kevin Kaczmarczyk. Well, Kevin, thanks for joining me here on Tools of the Trade. We're in the top secret O.P.G boardroom. This is very cool. So thank you for having me. And how about you just tell us a little bit about where we are today?
So we're located at our corporate head office at 700 University. We own a few floors, or I shouldn't say that. We lease a few floors in this building. It's not necessarily where I work day to day, but it was a convenient spot for us to meet up. So,
yeah, very cool. So we're both PMs. My job site's just down the road, which is super handy to get here, where there's a bit of a snowstorm going on outside right now. Hopefully it's the last of it for the year. But the place that I always like to get started with guests is to just speak a bit about your role. And I know that we can't go into extreme specifics, but it paints a good picture of what your position is and what your day-to-day is like so that people get a good sense of where we're coming from with some of the questions and answers that we'll be going through today. So what is your role today and what's your position and what does it look like a day in the shoes of Kevin in the life of Kevin?
that's a scary place to be. So my role, my title is project manager, electricity production. So in that role at Ontario Power Generation, which I coined at O.P.G, is essentially the planning and execution of small hydro development projects. So I'm on the hydro part of the business, not the nuclear side of the business. So essentially what that means for hydro development is, given the age of a variety of our assets across the province, they are quite old and they are, needing redevelopment or refurbishment. So we have a few of us on our team that specialize in that type of work. So analyzing, what is the most economical way of redeveloping these assets, planning out what that redevelopment looks like, and then executing as a construction project.
So after you get up in the morning and you kind of make your way into the office, what does a typical day look like for you?
A lot of Skyping and a lot of meetings. So one of the projects I'm working on right now, it has a bit of an international flavor to it. We have equipment suppliers in Europe. We have a contractor that has offices based across Canada. So quite a bit of coordination meetings just to make sure everybody's speaking the same language in terms of what comes next on the project. A lot of meetings, a lot of believe it or not, a lot of reading. I like to know everything that's going on in the project. So when it comes to going through the technical specifications or understanding contract language, quite a bit of downtime to spend just ensuring that that I got a good pulse on the project myself.
Yeah, it's so important. It's hard sometimes when you get these 4,000 or 5,000 page spec books and you've got to kind of know them like the back of your hand in order to deliver. And you definitely do need some downtime. Project management is, now that I've interviewed a few people and I'm in the role myself, I'm noticing that it isn't necessarily the first choice for a lot of people. People either kind of fall into the role or, by osmosis, they find their way into the project management scene and they tend to like it. And I was hoping that you could bring us back to your educational background, where that started and how you got interested in construction in the beginning.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm an engineer. That is my background. So on the mechanical discipline. I quickly learned in the University of Waterloo is where I went. I quickly learned that I wasn't going to be one of those engineers that could sit in an office and be looking at or being a designer or that type of engineer. It just wasn't really well suited for my skill set. The university that I went to, Waterloo, that being, they offered a really nice co-op program. And what that allowed students to do is sort of test drive what they wanted to do. So it allowed me to dabble a bit in the aerospace business. It allowed me to do some co-op terms in the manufacturing side, auto manufacturing. And then I stumbled across a co-op placement at Aecon on the industrial side of their business. And I got to say, I quickly fell in love with construction and project management at that point. So again, the beauty of the co-op program is, you can test drive things. You go back to school, you get your degree. Nice thing is I had a job waiting for me at Aecon when I graduated back in 2003.
Cool. Now, becoming an engineer, is that something that you were self-motivated to take on, or was that influenced by the parents? How did you decide engineering was for you?
Well, when the dad's an engineer, you kind of have to follow in the old man's footsteps. So
for sure.
What's funny is he's an electrical engineer, and I chose mechanical because it was a bit broader, it was more general. And I was really toying between civil and mechanical. So I wanted something that was a bit more general. And I didn't know at that point what I wanted to get into and what was a good fit for me. But, again, when I got exposed to project management and construction, I thought that was a good way for me to leverage my technical skill set and some of that theoretical knowledge that you pick up in university, right? And you can start applying it practically in the field.
Cool. So you go through engineering, you get the co-op placement at Aecon, and what's the first few months like for you at Aecon? Were you project manager right out of the gate, or were you a coordinator? What did it look like?
Yeah, at that point, and things are probably still the same today, but you start out as a coordinator, so as a project coordinator or a construction coordinator. At that point, I was assigned to site. So in the beginning, I was working with some automotive manufacturers, the likes of Cami and Toyota and Ford, and doing a lot of service and maintenance work, generally like maintenance overflow type work, where we would be coming in with building trades and doing line renovations or revamps or whatnot. And then so a lot of time spent in the field, supporting the trades, supporting the project manager, with various project management duties. So that was probably the first couple of years, in the automotive sector, and then a little bit in the power generation sector as well for Ontario Power Generation. Again, spending time on site and just helping manage not only construction management, but obviously reconciling some of the, what was happening in the field and reconciling that back to the office.
Right. When you're a project coordinator, and just for anybody that may not be experienced with sort of the hierarchy of a construction job site, you're reporting into a project manager at that point in time.
At that point, you're reporting into a project manager, but you also have, it's a dotted line, but it's somewhat of a solid line to the site super as well, because you're helping both of them out. So you're sort of a middleman between both of them.
Cool.
Yeah.
And then What was it that you think Aecon saw in you that pushed you into become a PM? Was there a conversation that was had? Was it just over time you just naturally grew into that position because you enjoyed it so much?
So I think it's the enjoyment aspect of it, right? I quickly developed a passion for it. I was young, I was hungry, worked a ton of hours, really committed to it and applied myself to it. Tried to learn the business, and learn from, the folks on site, the supers, and how that works, and the trade background. Not having an engineering background, not a trade background. There's something that I really wanted to capitalize on and extract that knowledge from the field, understand how things should operate on a construction site.
Yeah.
But then also try to polish, sort of on the office side, try to polish your, financial and business acumen on how project management works. So I just really committed to it. I loved it, and it never really felt like work. So it just drove me to want to be a PM.
What do you love about it? What drives you to be a PM, or what do you like most about construction?
A couple things, or many things, I should say. Definitely have a passion for it. I think that the one unique thing about being a project manager is, you're not only a leader, but someone gives you an entrepreneurial aspect to it, right? Because you're running a project, and yeah, you're doing that on behalf of an organization, but it's sort of your project, right? And you sort of own that, and you put a team in place, and generally speaking, you can, for the most part, you can sort of handpick, who you want on the team.
Yep.
Sometimes you're inheriting, different individuals, but you get to run it like it's your own business. And, from that standpoint, it's something that you're running from ground up. And you really get to see something evolve, and you're building something, generally speaking, and at least in my career, you're starting from nothing, right? And at the end of the day, you have some sort of asset that you're turning over to a customer, and something you can look back and be proud of. And that whole process of going through and from point A to point B, it's just something that it's thrilling to me.
Yeah, I feel the same way. There's something about being able to look back at something you built and know that you delivered it, and you have that autonomy. You're right. It's almost like you have the entrepreneurial aspect. I know that I kind of did it in the reverse order. I had a company, and then I fell into project management, and we had a small shop. So project management at that point in time wasn't, as professional as the way that I'm doing it now. And there's a lot of running around like a chicken with your head cut off, and, experiencing all aspects, wearing all the hats. But just getting back to your story again. So you're in Aecon, and I like to ask people about how they transitioned from one company to another. Obviously, sometimes the writing's on the wall, or, there's a mishap and they get let go. But in this case, I think it's a little different. And I'd like to hear about why you made the transition from the contractor side to the client side, because for those listening, we have the opportunity here to hear the other side of the fence. If anybody is currently on a project that's dealing with clients and they're pulling their hair out or they have questions, we're going to get into a bunch of stuff that relates to the client side. So I'd like to hear about that transition.
Yeah, I got to say, it's one of the most difficult decisions I ever had to make in my career. I really enjoyed the contractor side of the business. I think at that point in my life, and I was a very young project manager, managing, I think I was 25. I think actually at the time I was the youngest project manager in the company's history. I was doing quite well, and I was enjoying it, managing a handful of projects, probably about $200 million worth of projects. Wow. At that age.
Yeah.
And a lot of responsibility, but I loved it. But at the same token, I was starting a family, and I was traveling a lot, 70-hour weeks. I was away from home. And, I for personal reasons, I ended up making the shift. It like I said, it was the hardest thing that I've ever done, having to leave Aecon and move on to the owner side of the business. It's a great company, but ultimately I had to do what was right for me in my personal life, knowing that there's projects everywhere. There's multiple industries that you can apply project management. So it was sort of portable skills, and I decided to move on.
So what would you say a typical work week was in terms of hours at Aecon versus a typical work week here at O.P.G?
Oh, the same.
Yeah.
It's a bit different, with a lot of the travel and trying to get caught up on the contractor side. It was a lot of after hours work,
yeah,
especially if you're traveling. And then just the urgency of the responses as well, right? When there's sort of profit in the back of your mind, right? And productivity concerns and whatnot, the pace is faster on the contractor side.
Right.
versus the owner side. But you know what? In terms of hours, that's really just speaks to one's appetite, right? When they're hungry and it doesn't feel like work and there's a passion to be involved in your project, the hours can be very similar.
Yeah. I think a lot of people struggle with that. They think that they should be able to work a 40-hour week and check out. To some degree, I agree that, you need to have freedom. But at the same time, like you mentioned, if you find your life's work and what you're passionate about, then it doesn't necessarily feel like work, as you mentioned, which is a great thing. But I feel as though that can also help you deal with stress a little bit better. And when you're 25 years old and you're managing $200 million worth of work, or even now when you're managing a critical project of some kind, do your stress levels get up there? Do you have a way of dealing with that stress on projects?
I think at the time as I reflect on it, as you're talking, and I'm like, I've aged quite a bit since then as well, right? So over time, as you mature, you start to develop better, let's say, strategies or coping mechanisms, right? On how to manage your own time versus your staff's time. I think when I was younger, in terms of the stress levels, I think some of them were self-induced, and they likely were because I wasn't delegating enough.
Right.
And it's not that I thought I could do the work better. I just enjoyed doing the work so much, so I just dove in, and I didn't recognize the need that, hey, you know what, Kevin, you could burn out, right? And now as you fast forward sort of 15 years down the road, in terms of the differential of hours, it's about working smarter, not harder, right? And
For sure.
I think I've just been able to develop my leadership skills, being able to train and mentor staff a little bit more effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that within itself, it just helps you manage stress, right? Just to realize the importance of a work-home balance. And I think that was one of the shifts for me is, going from that fast-paced environment to an environment that was a bit more predictable, allowed me to focus a little bit more time on family and sort of recenter myself on sort of what my priorities are.
Yep.
But then also to teach myself to manage my time better, manage my project teams, my projects, try not to get into all the details, sort of step back and try to be more of a thought leader where you can.
Mm-hmm.
Easier said than done, though.
Yeah, no kidding. Do you have any tips before we get into project management specifics? We're on the topic now of time management. And I was thinking about this today. Sometimes I'm getting in excess of 80 to 100 emails a day. And obviously I'm on a P3 project, so there's a lot of.
I'm just kidding.
I could be selling myself short, but what I find is a lot of stuff is on an FYI basis that you file away, and you may or may not need to ever revisit that. But you need to have it in the background in case there's a claim or there's some sort of issue on the job that you need to go back and have that documentation for. But do you have any tips for understanding the optics behind the requests that are coming in from various people on a project and how you can quickly decipher what's going to require your immediate attention?
That's a good question. I'm a bit old school when it comes to email.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is I read every email. I'm a bit of a stickler about that kind of thing. I read every email. I file every email. Gives me a sense of calmness when my inbox is down to sort of one screen size.
Yeah.
And I know I'm staying on top of things.
Do you ever hit inbox zero?
I do, but
Yeah.
I try to get there before I go on holidays. It's one of those things that I do. It just helps me manage my time. And, that way I do a lot of skimming, and we get similar amounts of email a day, you and I, right? So 80 to 100 emails on top of meetings. You want to stay on top of all the issues and, skimming, filing, having a really good filing system for your emails, I find is helpful for me. So I know where to go if I need to extract things.
Yep.
And that way when I'm scanning quick, drag and dropping, it's something I kind of prioritize, but it's something that I expect of my team members as well, though, is to be responsive to emails. It is our primary form of communication, especially with, international-based teams. There's a lot of emails. So I'm really old school when it comes to emails and tracking them and being attentive to responding to them. But I'm also old school that sometimes it's just a hell of a lot easier just to pick up the phone and call somebody.
Oh, yeah.
And just to work through that. But then again, too, though, when you want to get something formally recorded or something on record, that's sometimes it's difficult, right? Where you pick up the phone and then what am I going to send an email to somebody saying, as per our discussion,
Well, yeah, exactly.
Right. So then it's like, well, why pick up the phone and phone somebody? I can just send them an email, right?
Right.
But what if they're not responsive to email? So it's I think you just have to know your team members or the client or the contractor that you're that you're corresponding with, and do your best to stay on top of it.
In regards to that, I have seen a couple applications that are in the beta stage that you basically download this application on your phone, and what it does is you can receive calls through and dial out of that app. And what it does is it transcribes the conversation, sends both parties a copy, or sends you a copy that you can send out. So, maybe tech is going to solve some of these issues that we're talking about. We're on the cusp. There's also another, it's kind of a funny application. I can't remember the name of it. I'll give it to you after, but you basically go on this web browser, type in your email address and the password. And what it does is it initiates this game, and it starts going from the first email to the last. And you have 45 seconds to decide what you're doing with it. File it, delete it, or not touch it.
Oh, wow.
But it's kind of a fun way, and they throw games in there and they make it points based. And if anybody listening is having issues with their inbox, I'll link to it on the website. But it's a fun way to just like knock it right down if you're in a pinch and you got to just go through everything quick. It gives you that, like, there's music in the background. It's kind of funny, but I'm digressing here. So you've seen both sides of the industry, and that's something that I really wanted to get your perspective on. What do you see as major differences in transitioning to the client side from the contractor side? Obviously, there's quite a few, I'm sure.
I think having the experience of working on both sides is so beneficial. There's a definite transition that happens between the two. And I know when I had moved from the contractor side to the owner side, I found myself having to explain the contractor's position a lot, to the likes of health and safety managers on, why they're electing to do things a certain way, or whether that being supply chain or procurement.
Right.
Why the contractor has structured their proposal in a certain way, or why they're taking exception to this terms and condition, what might be going through sort of their mind in terms of when they're forming that proposal. So I'm finding myself I'm helping to sort of transfer some of that knowledge, right? And get sought out a lot for, what's your opinion on this claim, for instance, or this exception, or how the contractor is acting on site perhaps, or responding to certain ones of our requests. But the transition, it's not hard in that project management is a very versatile skill set. Whether you go from the contractor side to the owner side, or whether you're going from one industry to another, it's a very transferable and versatile skill set. So from that standpoint, a project's a project, right? It's just your lens is, whether you're, profit driven, perhaps on the contractor side, versus more, compliance and budget driven on the owner side.
Makes sense.
So there's similarities. As I mentioned, that the pace is different. I think that it is faster pace on the contractor side. You could arguably say it's a bit more exciting because you are really influencing change, and you're influencing things a lot faster than on the owner side. And sometimes it's hard for an owner to be on the sidelines. It's one of those, like put me in, coach type things, right? Because especially when you're on the owner side and you're not acting as the constructor. So if you're hands off, legislatively, right? Sometimes you are on the sidelines, and you're monitoring for cost and schedule compliance and quality compliance, right? But you're sort of on the sidelines, right? So sometimes it's hard not to get your hands dirty.
It's funny. I kind of even experienced that coming in with an electrical background. And then, delegating installations. Sometimes I wish that I could just throw the tools on for a day and go out there and build something.
Yeah.
It's kind of that give and take. And it's funny. Yeah, I could see that happening on the client side for sure. One of the things that I've seen happen, I'm about to be a part of one this week actually, is they're called a multitude of different things, but they're essentially team building or socializing activities that take place between the contractors and the clients to raise issues, get to know each other, have a glass of wine, spend a day together. Do you think that is a helpful approach, or how do you see that relationship or understanding being navigated better in the industry? Because it seems as though if you're both speaking the same language, it's going to be a lot easier, and you're able to facilitate that because you've seen the other side. But when you're with a group of individuals that maybe hasn't seen the other side, and you certainly haven't seen their side, then there's a lot of, you're both trying to say the same thing, but you're both coming at it from a different stance. So do you think that there's a way that could be navigated better for both parties? Do you think events like that work? What's your take on that whole?
I do think they work. Every company has different policies when it comes to that. So sometimes, especially in the public sector, there's a lot of rigidity there. There's a line that can and cannot be crossed. So,
right.
I would caution some to that. But, in my own personal opinion, it is a project team. And, whether you have internal or external stakeholders. So your contractor, for instance, is obviously not part of your internal team. They're external, but they're still part of the overall team. And generally speaking, when you like it or not, you're sort of stuck together with your counterparts on the contractor side for, could be a year, could be 2 years, could be a 5-year project, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at the end of the day, why should that be any different than your own internal team? So I always encourage that I think it's good to develop a good, solid working relationships with their contractors. I think it never hurts to go have a beer with somebody and get to know them on a personal level. And that way, when you're dealing with difficult issues, because that's what we do as project managers, right? We're dealing with either commercially sensitive issues or whatever the case may be. You can have a beer or break bread with somebody and get down to the root of the issue and feel comfortable and you trust the other party to work through those issues. I'd like to think that it can only help, especially in those difficult conversations, right? And sometimes when you get in, you see these owner and these contractor conflicts, right? Both parties, if there's a lack of trust, if there's a lack of a solid working relationship, it's hard for them to sort of navigate that environment. So I'm a big proponent of it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Sometimes when you're down to it on the job site and you're stuck in the day-to-day and, well, like you mentioned, going through 80, 100 emails, meetings, trying to make it all work, sometimes the last thing you feel like doing is spending that extra little bit of time after work or on a weekend getting to know somebody a bit better. But it goes a long way when you take the blinders off and you just get to understand where somebody comes from and
Absolutely
make a connection.
There's so many times where you're having a drink afterwards or you're having dinner. Whether this is on the contractor side or on the owner side, and inevitably you talk about work, right? And I can't tell you the amount of nuggets that have come away from
Oh, yeah.
that. You know what I mean? Where you come to realizations or you come up with some ideas where everybody's just sort of relaxed and because no matter how hard you try, like work comes up, right?
Oh, for sure.
And you're working after hours, but you're working in a generally a little bit more of an enjoyable, sort of safe environment.
Yeah.
And I find it just makes the relationship, makes the project, or could make the relationship and the project more constructive, more productive.
Definitely.
Yep.
You got to make sure that you keep it to 1 or 2 though, and then you could ruin the project if you're not careful.
Yeah, that'd be my second recommendation.
So obviously in your career, you've been on, how many projects do you think that you've been involved in?
Whew. I couldn't count them over 15 years. It's
so let's just say quite a few, and I'm sure some have been fantastic and others haven't been so great. And I'm sure that you've had a project that has failed or that you've witnessed fail. And you don't have to go into specifics about companies or jobs or projects or anything, but what's it like when a project starts failing? Have you been through that experience?
I think you have to almost start on, okay, well, what do you define as a project failure, right? Because there's so many ways of looking at that.
Yep.
Right. So do you look at failure as a project hasn't met its cost and schedule commitments? Okay, that's fair. Is a failure that you've incurred, God forbid, lost time incident or a critical injury on a site? Is that a failure? You've had, reportable spill on site, perhaps environmentally, right? Is that a failure? At the end of the day, whatever asset you're turning over, right? Is it functioning properly? Does the customer at the end of the day, right? Are they happy? So there's so many ways where I can almost, when I look at failure, and I was having this conversation the other day with a colleague of mine. What does failure mean to you, right? But believe it or not, and I was thinking about this, that I don't think I've actually ever had a project that's failed. I've had challenging projects, but I've never had a project that's gone over budget or has been delayed beyond, the commitment. Mm-hmm. From a safety and environmental side, yeah, I've had some regrettable incidents that have occurred. I think from that standpoint, I don't have an unblemished health and safety record. And I think the industry has evolved quite a bit over the last 15 years in that regard. But what I focus sort of the most important thing for me is the customer aspect. I like to think of myself as a project manager that you're sort of a services provider in one respect or another, right? You're providing a service. Yep. And at the end of the day, if I'm providing that service, there is a customer, there's an end user, there's something that's going to inherit, what you've constructed. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing I'm most proud of is at the end of the day, does the individual or the organization that's inheriting that asset, are they happy? That's my biggest measure. And to date, I've been fortunate. I've had some good teams that have pulled me through some dark times. Yeah. But I think for the most part, we've always been successful in the end.
That's great. Well, maybe you can drop your number at the end of this and you'll get a few phone calls of
Well,
good opportunities.
And I'm speaking honestly here. I gave this a lot of thought actually, and I was having this conversation the other week, and I've been very fortunate to surround myself with good people, and specifically, I think that very, very strong site foremen, site superintendents, construction managers, good project control staff. I've had good mentors. When you surround yourself around good people, and when issues do come up, because let's face it, no project is, I'm not giving off the impression that projects are picture perfect.
Yeah.
A lot of blood, sweat, and tears. But when you surround yourself with good people that are willing to go that extra mile for you and push through the hard times, I've been very fortunate. Very fortunate my projects have gone well.
That's great. Well, if we speak about, let's just say, schedule and budget, I think, obviously projects all have their various goals, zero lost time and things like this. But if we talk about projects from hitting a budget and a schedule as a goal for that project, where do you think some of the biggest challenges come up, or where do people turn a blind eye that they should maybe focus more attention?
I'm going to give you maybe a little bit of a cliche answer here.
Okay.
But stay with me here.
Yeah.
So it all starts with planning, and we all hear that, right? But the planning aspects on project management, they are so important, right? From the get-go, like, from the owner's side, do you have the appropriate contracting strategy in place? Have you thought through all the regulatory approvals? Have you developed a work breakdown structure? And I'm not going to get theoretical or all PMBOK-y here, but what does that starting point look like on a project? And have you really thought through and given yourself enough time for the planning? To me, that's something that I always want to ensure that you leave yourself enough time with. But the other thing here that comes to mind, and this is probably more of my contractor's background that sort of influenced me on the owner side, is really ensuring that you have the right specifications in place, the right scope of work, because that is always going to be the basis of the contract. So spending the time making sure that you have clear, concise, well-prepared specifications on the front end is going to give, on the owner side, it's going to give the owner a sense of assurance that there's a sense of confidence to the cost and schedule commitment, because the contractor is identifying or developing their price and their schedule based on a clear set of specifications.
Mm-hmm.
On the contractor side, obviously, it's, that's key, right? You can only price what you see.
That's right.
Price what you interpret, right? And I think, spending that time on the front end, obviously there's a lot of projects that try to get fast tracked, and planning should be run within a project within itself. Each of my planning phases, they have a schedule. You have certain deliverables in your planning phase, right? Make sure you give yourself sufficient time, plan everything out from a deliverable standpoint, and get the right resources in place to help you move the planning phase along.
There's something you touched on there, is you can only price what you see on the drawings. And you hear horror stories of people that have taken that as leverage to win bids, and then you come back and you change order the hell out of it, and it ends up, the issue there is, when you have that many change orders that have to go through because the specifications are off, that is so disruptive to a project flow.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. And it's a very interesting, when you get into, and I've had projects on both sides of the fence like that, where as a contractor, you have no alternate recourse other than to change order the hell out of the client. And you're not doing that necessarily maliciously, but at the end of the day, there is a proposed change in the way that you have developed your proposal, developed your execution strategy, right? There's a change to the basis of your price. What other option do you have at that point, right? Is, you need to present change. You need to be compensated for that additional effort or that change in circumstance. I'll tell you, owners don't like that.
No,
right?
Of course not.
And, and I think, and I don't have any metrics to back this up, but somebody early in my career had told me this, and I've never really seen it documented anywhere. Maybe you have, but there's a misconception from on the owner side that the contractors make a lot of money on change orders.
That's a huge misconception. I was talking to somebody about that the other day.
Yeah. And, I've said this time and time again on the owner side that it's, from my standpoint, at least in a contractor, and again, this is one of my mentors that told me this as well, is I just want to come in on the contractor side, do the project the way I propose to do it. Don't interfere with me. Don't change the circumstances around me. Just let me execute per my original proposal, right? And that when that proposal or that execution strategy starts changing, it becomes possibly a nightmare, right?
Yeah.
And on the owner side, there is a misconception that the contractors change ordering us to death, and they're making additional money, when in reality, and sometimes that is the case. I'm sure those instances do exist, right? But on the flip side, contractors are doing that because they need to be compensated for the additional effort, or the impact that has had to their approach. So it's one of those things that I contend with a lot, right? Is change is inevitable. You need to have a well laid out procedure to identify it. But I think it's within our human nature. Nobody likes surprises.
That's right.
And I say that so much on my projects. I don't like surprises. So let's be open and transparent. If there's changes coming down the pipeline, if there's issues that you're contending with, don't wait as a contractor and tell me that the days before it's going to happen. If you see something coming down the pipeline, let's have an early issues identification process. So let's put it on the table. Let's see how we can work together to prevent this from actually being a change. Maybe there's something in the specification or there's something in regards to this issue that I can influence on the owner's side to help minimize the impact of that change. So change is an interesting discussion on its own, for sure.
Yeah, I've seen two things happen with changes. One is there's no template from the outset of what a change looks like in terms of cost impact and price and different rates for different individuals that will be included in those. And I've seen projects where it does happen. And obviously on large projects, it is a requirement, usually as a sub-trade to general contractor.
Yep.
And you lay those rates out so there is no surprises that come through. But if you don't have that sort of template in place that says, look, we're on this project for this amount of time, rates may increase due to labor and whatever else, but here's what the base of our changes are going to look like. There's no surprises on that aspect. And I've actually seen some general contractors that deploy their own estimating team to estimate the change to verify the sub-trade's cost to ensure. So we're not out here, change ordering people to put money in the company's pocket necessarily. You're right. We're covering our costs, and a lot of times we're back checked, and you can't just get away with, pulling the wool over people's eyes. It doesn't work like that, especially on large, organized projects. It doesn't happen.
Well, and believe it or not, even on the owner side, we'll deploy resources as well, right? When changes are coming in, being presented to us from, let's say, from the prime or from the general, and maybe that's worked up from from subcontractors, right? But we take the time to go through this, check numbers, look at our historical databases or our historical information. Okay, is this fair? Is the contractor being reasonable? There tends sometimes to be as well is, and this is where some of that combativeness can sometimes happen, is you start to become defensive.
Yeah.
Right. So it's, let's say, you're working for me, I'm the owner, you're the contractor, you present a change to me. I think my specifications and my contract is picture perfect. We don't have a relationship. I could be offended by your change.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm not saying that always exists, right? But it speaks to the importance of having a good working relationship, having a good structure in place, like you said, clear specifications, never
Clear
hurts,
specs,
but,
yeah.
understanding what that change protocol is, and hopefully there's an issues identification process where at least we can start talking about that change before it actually manufactures, before it turns into something significant. I think that's proactivity is key, and like I said, I hate surprises.
Yeah. So I'm sure you have in the past at Aecon, but being on the client side now, you must have to deal with a lot of negotiation.
Tons.
And do you have any tips for negotiating, whether it's price? And this is very generic. I'll let you take the question, whatever avenue you want to take it. But negotiating doesn't come natural, just as leadership doesn't come natural to a lot of people. It's an acquired skill. And maybe you can just touch on a few things that you've learned in negotiating contracts and different things, changes, whatever it may be.
Oh, it's just, I don't know if it's an art or a science. It's probably more of an art. Negotiations are difficult, right? I think for me, what's helped, at least I can speak from my own personal experience, knowing the subject matter always goes a long way, right? So negotiating a contract that I'm very familiar with, that I spent the time to really understand the terms and conditions. It's hard to negotiate something that you don't know what you're negotiating, right? Especially if it's something that's commercially sensitive. So what I've tend to have done in the past is, believe it or not, I've spent a lot of time with lawyers and really trying to understand the contract. And when owners and contractors are negotiating over different terms and conditions, really understanding the implication of those. Because sometimes sometimes I get kind of scratch my head a bit because we're arguing over what type of like wordsmithing, but what are the meaning of those words? And what does that actual clause in the contract mean? What are the repercussions?
Mm-hmm.
And then, most importantly is asking the other party sometimes, okay, well, why are you asking for this? Why is this important to you? Just tons of times in negotiations where I just really didn't understand where the other party was coming from, and just sometimes just stopping and saying, okay, well, why is this important? What are your interests behind this? And I found that's been a pretty helpful tactic, right? Is,
Communication.
communication.
I'm seeing a common thread here.
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
everything that you've talked about. It really comes down to being able to pick the phone up, which is almost a lost art these days.
Yep.
And talking to people and just understanding where they're coming from. Because maybe the reason that person put in that specific clause or priced something the way they did is because they have a good reason for it that you didn't think of.
Yep.
Maybe you're going to learn something.
100%.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is actually, especially in negotiations, but, let's say maybe more in, post-bid sort of negotiations or sort of that clarification stage, right? And I think another useful tip is, don't be afraid to ask those questions, right? If you see a particular hole in a proposal, perhaps, right? Or on the contractor side, if you see a hole in the scope of work, right, is to be proactive in asking that question. I can't tell you how many times from the owner side where I see a blatant miss on the contractor side, and I have two decisions at that point, right? I can choose to ignore it, right, knowing that it's definitely a miss, or I can identify it and saying, maybe you should, take a second look at, this particular scope item, or are you confident with how you assess this particular work package, or whatever the case is. I think that earns you a lot of credibility too when it comes to negotiations, right? Is that each party is really looking out for each other's best interests. Because at the end of the day, if the contractors miss something or the owners miss something, 9 times out of 10, that's going to come up. Sometime in the project, it's going to come up, and it's likely going to have a negative impact on one or both of the parties. So the proactivity and the focus on communication, and really understanding each party's interests.
Yeah, absolutely. When we talk about all these things, one of the things that is essential when you're managing a project is to manage the risks and kind of, smell the smoke before there's fire and make sure that you're organizing the project in a way to mitigate risks. And obviously, again, it's like goals for a project. There's so many different types of risks you can explore. But what are some of the most important things to think about when you're trying to plan for risk on a project? Do you have any tools or things that you deploy when you're trying to assess risk? Or even if it's on a decision by decision basis, when you're looking at something and trying to compare the cost benefit or the risk of this going through or not going through, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, it's amazing how much the focus on risk management has changed over the span of my career. I'll be completely honest with you. Coming at my first job, my first project, we weren't really talking about risk, and now it's a real, especially on the owner side, it's a real big emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
Is trying to really understand the risks and the mitigations that are put in place on a project. So that particular knowledge area, right, or that function on a project is grown a lot of legs over the last 15 years, at least from what I've seen. Where one of the things though that when I think about risk, and somebody asked me this question the other day as well, I almost think it's a project manager's intuition. It's a sense, or at least it should be. As a seasoned project manager, do you need a very detailed risk register to get a better understanding of your risks? Or should you just feel them and see them, right? And I think there's sort of a fine line between the two. I do think there's a little bit of sixth sense or intuition to risks, is sort of those spidey feeling.
Yeah.
But it never hurts to write things down. So going back to your question about tools, I think each project needs a scalable approach to doing risk management.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it starts very simple by identifying all your risks, working with your project team, identifying your risks. It doesn't have to be an elaborate risk register or anything like that, but just somewhere where you can document the risks and get a better appreciation on the magnitude of them and what you're doing to control or mitigate those risks. And and that could be, I've seen this, in elaborate risk registers, and I've seen this in very simple risk tables. But I think that's just a simple tool, and just committing as a project team to reviewing that periodically. That could be once a year. That could be twice a year. That could be every week. But you have to feel your way through that, right?
Yeah.
I like to do it monthly, minimum quarterly, but monthly is something I recommend. It shouldn't be something that you just do internally in your project team. I actually think one of some of the most successful risk management processes I've done is where you're actually doing it collaboratively with the contractor. And when you get, and there's some commercial sensitivities here, but when you're doing risk management with a contractor and the owner together, and asking yourself those real questions, okay, what can possibly go wrong on this project? What are potential holes in your proposal? It's a very dangerous question to ask, but
Yeah.
when you can start getting to that level of conversation, you are doing risk management. You're identifying issues. You're identifying potential risks. If this happens, what are we going to do about it? And there's a lot of different contracting models now that sort of drive that open and transparent approach, right? So I think it's just a simple tool. Again, I don't think I ever saw a risk register in the beginning of my career,
Interesting.
and now I probably see too many of them.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's important, and as things grow and evolve and the project scales get larger and technology goes in place, there's a lot more room for error and there's a lot more risk that we're all seeing, I'm sure. With that being said, is there any trends? Like, you've been a project manager for quite a while now. Is there any trends you're seeing in the industry? Do you see project management changing a whole lot in the future?
Definitely the technology has advanced quite considerably in regards to project management, the focus on data and automation and integration between standalone software programs. I got to say the days of Excel,
Yeah.
simple tool. Everybody uses it well, and that simplicity of utilizing Excel for pretty much everything in the front end of my career, to having a software tool for pretty much anything now. I find that's been the biggest shift, and the trend to really try to automate the process, collect data, for performance measurement purposes or for continuous improvement purposes. So obviously a big focus on data,
Yep.
and knowledge retention. But I think software is really taken off the last 15 years.
Yeah, it's going crazy right now. Can't even imagine what's going to be coming in the next 15. It's going to be completely different, in my opinion.
It's unbelievable. When I think back when I started, there was really very limited usage. Primavera P6,
Yep.
primarily Microsoft project based. Basically just using a back-end financial system with some spreadsheets on the front end. And now in terms of measuring earned value and cost performance, change management, there's software systems for that. Document management.
It's huge.
This is pre-SharePoint we're talking, right? And
Yeah.
now there's obviously SharePoint, but then there's also specific content management software programs that are out there. It's quite amazing, actually, the evolution. Geez, it was limited use of fax machines now, right? But
Yeah.
everything before were RFIs and changes were you used to fax them to the client, right? So like even just like those little things, right? And
That's crazy.
And I'm not even that old, but but in the span of 15, 20 years, it's a lot has happened. The trend in terms of doing things faster,
Yeah.
and trying to automate the process, and obviously when that degree of automation is how do you translate the information from the field back to the office in the most efficient way possible.
That's right.
I think that's where software has really helped.
Very cool. Well, you've been in the industry for a long time, and I'm sure you've learned a lot. We will get to some more personal questions, but what kind of advice would you lend to a young project manager that's just getting started in the industry? Maybe they're a coordinator right now, or maybe it's somebody that's taking on their first project. You can take this however you want, but what kind of advice would you lend that person when they're getting started in their career to help them advance and progress and grow and really flourish as a PM?
Yeah, I would say, in the beginning of my career, I think one of the things that helped me tremendously was to get out in the field. Wherever that project is being executed, get out there as much as you can. And obviously, if they're a coordinator right now, they're probably spending a lot of time in that field. And that is, in my opinion, the best investment you're going to have in your career is really understanding anything from site logistics to managing trades to procuring material, receiving material, right, to reporting on schedule, costs, and timesheets and all those fun stuff, right?
Yeah.
But if you understand how all that works, it's going to make you really effective as a project manager. So I think that's like my number one advice is you got to get out in the field, right? Get out of the office, get out in the field, wherever that may be. Commit to it, because I think as in my case, the older you get and when you settle down, it's to be a little bit more difficult to travel to the field. So you really need to leverage that experience you get in the front end to really anticipate and understand what's happening in the field without being there as often as you are.
Yep.
So I think that's advice number one. Second, this one's going to sound a bit cliche, but in terms of, seeking a mentor, I've had a lot of great mentors in my career. And, you start with a company. I was a young coordinator, looked around the company, looked up, and, there was a few individuals that really stood out that I connected with, that I really respected. And, took the opportunity to, have the odd golf game with them or go have a beer and to really develop a relationship with them and get advice, someone that I could, and luckily for me, it wasn't necessarily somebody that was my boss, but, I've had lots of bosses as well that have been mentors, but that's so important to find somebody that you idolize or that you respect their skill set, or somebody that's just perfected their craft, right? And you just want to learn on how they've done it. I think that's an important one. I would add the last thing is in terms of the continuous improvement aspect of it, or the professional development. It's hard to find time for training, right? To take a time out, take a pause in your everyday life. The crazy, like you said, the 100 emails a day, the meetings, right? And the project's not stopping, but you need to take time for yourself. And that professional development, whether you want to get, for me, I got certified in my PMP.
Yep.
And spent the time to go through the PMBOK, as exciting as it is, to study and prepare for that, right? But to go through that professional development process and other great training programs or courses that I've had around negotiation or stakeholder management or risk management or project controls, right? Like, you got to keep those tools sharp, right? And I got to say, every time you go on training, you walk away with at least 2 or 3 new learnings. Doesn't matter what part you are in your career, make a point to take a training course once or twice a year and sharpen up on whatever skills you need to sharpen up on.
Is there any courses in particular that you found stood out in terms of value?
Believe it or not, and for those of us that have done the PMP, it's quite an undertaking to go through that PMBOK cover to cover.
Going through right now.
It's intense and it's very theoretical, somewhat idealistic on how to run a project. But with that being said, it gives you a really good foundation, right? I think that's a really good foundation for a project manager to understand how companies have developed their governing processes. For the most part, they're developing their governing processes from PMBOK or from other best practice organizations, in the world. So that's one for me that's a standout in terms of good foundational knowledge. I've had a lot of success focusing on the soft skills as well. So leadership, negotiation.
Yep.
I took a great negotiation course, and it was a bunch of lawyers that were teaching it. It was one of the best courses I ever had, and you got to do a lot of role playing and try to negotiate with a lawyer. That was a lot of fun when you had to do the role playing and do some interest-based negotiation. That was really cool. But in negotiation, alternate dispute resolution is some training I've done. I think that was a real standout. And when I started my career, the third standout for me was there was a mechanical contracting project management course I took at the University of Waterloo.
Okay.
And it was like a 10-day program that I had taken that Aecon had put me through at the time, and that covered anything from construction claims through to how to build a schedule, how to track a schedule, invoicing processes, and it was I'm not even sure if it's still around, but those are sort of the highlights looking back for me that have been influential, at least in my career.
That's awesome. Well, that's exactly what I was looking for. Those are some great tools. Is there anything else PM specific that you want to touch on before we get into some rapid fire questions and start to wrap up?
No, I think I'm good.
The guy that doesn't fail on projects, he's got nothing else to say, eh? I'm just screwing with you. No, it's good fun, man. That's awesome. So with these rapid fire questions, I like to ask them at the end of the interview. I start with your story. I like to end with just some personal tidbits, stuff that piques my curiosity. The first question being, do you caffeinate?
I do.
And the reason why I ask that is because I've had quite a few people say that they don't drink coffee. So I'm always looking for a good cup. I've got Starbucks here right now. Unfortunately, it's not my favorite, but
yeah.
What do you go for coffee?
I'm pretty easy. I like Starbucks. I'll do Tim's. I'll do McDonald's. Lately, I got an espresso machine at my house.
Yeah, so did I actually.
And that was a game changer. So now I'm turning into a bit of a coffee snob.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite color Nespresso pod?
The Intenso and
Yeah,
the
the-
Stormio.
Yeah, it's good, right?
Yeah.
Man, it changed my life. I never liked espresso until I had one.
Yep.
With Nespresso, and that's a morning ritual for sure.
Yep.
So you go to a lot of courses and you educate yourself in various ways, but do you read?
Not as much as I'd like to. Believe it or not, I spend so much time at work reading. I actually don't find it relaxing after hours to do that.
Yeah.
It's just because, again, I'm reading every email. I pride myself in going through specifications and project management plans and sometimes legislation. So I'm soaking things up during the day so much. When I get home, sometimes I just need to turn off that engine.
Mm-hmm.
So I find it's not a good path for me after hours.
Yeah, I'm experiencing a similar thing. I kind of stopped reading almost altogether.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously I consume podcasts and I create podcasts and I do listen to the odd audiobook, but maybe that's what it is. It's just the constant reading, 4,000 page spec books and emails, and there's no room left at the end of the day.
I find, I need, music or podcast or news or something like that just to, when you're coming from home and then come home to the kids, right? It's just, it gives me that sort of that natural break, right? Where I can sort of transition to, okay, there's work. I want to try to shut that off because I already know it's not healthy for me if I don't, right?
Yep.
So I try to stay away from work related stuff, believe it or not, when I'm in a car, surprisingly, but I do listen to very few project management podcasts, right? There are some that I dabble in, but it's something I think I need to start doing a little bit more.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always thought that I would want to consume more construction related content, but I'm talking to people about it all day, after work, during work, on weekends, and I listen to Formula One podcasts and things that are completely unrelated. But
mine's fantasy football.
Yours is?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Who's your team?
Well, I don't know if you play fantasy football, but it's do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes. I don't play, but I know what you're talking about.
Okay. Well, I cheer for the Patriots, but so for me, I have this intense rivalry with my high school buddies, and we all have a fantasy football team. And so when we first started this league up about 5 years ago, I finished last. And anyways, they never let me forget about it. So then I stepped up my game. I started listening and studying fantasy football, and I came back and I won 2 years in a row.
There you go.
That. So
what's the grand prize? Trophy, belt, cash?
Just bragging rights.
Yeah.
And a trophy.
That's cool.
Yeah.
It's funny. My old man has been having Super Bowl parties since he was 29 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a trophy that's been circulating at that party every single year. And they're crazy about the fantasy football and all that other stuff. So I know exactly what you're talking about. The rivalry's huge.
It's huge. It's huge. Yeah. We actually have same group of friends. We have a Super Bowl ritual where we still toss the football outside every Super Bowl. We get together. So it's all sort of connected with our rivalry. So
nice.
It's a good tradition.
So kind of the last question I want to ask you before I give you the floor to leave behind something for people to think about. If you think of where you are now as a PM and where you were when you started, what one piece of advice would you lend yourself?
Work hard. Nothing comes easy. Take the time to perfect your craft, and you got to work at it. I can't think of any professional athlete. A lot of talking about athletes, but obviously they're born sometimes with a skill set, but they still have to work hard at their craft, work hard at their conditioning, learn from their mistakes. It's no different when you're a project manager. You got to perfect your craft, right? You got to understand, go through your lessons learned at the end of the project, understand what went wrong, constantly try to focus on solutions on projects. There's so many challenges, but if you're always focusing on positivity and solutions, moving things forward, it helps you perfect your craft. But ultimately, it comes with hard work. It's not a 9-to-5 job. It's going to require you to really extend yourself. Because again, it's that entrepreneurial aspect, right? It's your baby.
Yep.
Right? You got to push it forward, because if you're not going to do it, then who is?
That's right. It's not for the faint of heart. You got to put the work in. I think anything that's worth achieving never comes easy, and it does require the work. So it's really no different.
Yep.
Is there anything else you'd like to leave behind for people to think about or ponder as we sign off here?
Well, as somebody that's passionate in project management and looking at the demographics across the industry, there's tons of opportunity in project management, tons. And if you're hungry and you're willing to work hard and you're genuinely interested in whatever industry, because as I mentioned, it's a transferable skill set, So I'm a huge proponent of my career choice and advocating project management to folks coming out of university, whether they be technical or not, or even in, perhaps not even coming out of university and going the trades route and approaching project management from that avenue. I think it's a great career, and I think it's a hell of a lot of fun too.
I agree.
Yeah.
Kev, this has been awesome. Thanks so much for sharing everything that you've learned from both the contractor side and the client side and your story, and for inviting me up to the top secret O.P.G office here. I've had a blast, and thanks again, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime. My pleasure.
That's a wrap. That's a wrap, everybody.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Tools of the Trade podcast. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave us a 5-star review. For show notes, blog posts, resources, and access to our newsletter, check out toolspodcast.com.